Anxiety is often described as a purely mental struggle, but for those living through it, the experience is profoundly physical. That suffocating pressure in the chest, the sensation of walls closing in, and an unpredictability that can stretch from hours into days. It's more than just a passing worry, it's a full-body alert system that refuses to shut off. While we have tools like medication that offer significant relief for many, they rarely provide a complete cure on their own. We're finding that the most sustainable path through these overwhelming moments often involves a much broader network of support, ranging from intentional community and faith to the simple but difficult practice of gratitude.
That physical intensity is something many people underestimate if they haven't felt it themselves. Research from institutions like the Cleveland Clinic explains that when the body enters that fight or flight mode, it releases a surge of adrenaline and cortisol. This doesn't just make you feel nervous, it actually tightens the intercostal muscles between your ribs, which is exactly why people describe that crushing feeling in their chest. It's a literal biological response to a perceived threat, even if that threat isn't visible in the room. Recognizing that this is a shared human experience is the first step toward breaking the isolation that usually makes anxiety worse.
It's interesting you mention isolation because that seems to be where anxiety really thrives. When you're in the middle of a panic attack or a multi-day episode of high tension, it feels like you're the only person on an island. There's a persistent stigma that suggests anxiety is a personal failure or a lack of willpower. How does shifting our view of anxiety to a shared human experience actually help someone when they're struggling to breathe?
It changes the narrative from something is wrong with me to this is something my nervous system is doing. When we realize that approximately 40 million adults in the United States alone deal with anxiety disorders, according to the National Institute of Mental Health, it starts to strip away that layer of unique shame. Community support has been shown in various studies to reduce symptoms of depression and anxiety by as much as 20 to 30%. That's a huge margin. It works because connection provides validation. When you tell someone, I feel like I can't breathe, and they don't look at you like you're crazy, but instead say, I've been there, it's scary, and it will pass, you're co-regulating your nervous systems. You're no longer fighting the tiger alone.
That co-regulation sounds powerful, but I want to touch on the medical side of this. Many people rely on SSRIs or benzodiazepines to manage their daily lives. You mentioned that medication isn't a complete cure. Is there a risk in over-relying on the clinical side while neglecting the community or emotional aspects?
Medication is an incredibly valuable tool, especially for moderate to severe cases where it can lower the baseline of distress enough so that a person can actually engage in other types of healing. SSRIs and SNRIs are evidence-based and effective for millions. However, clinical reports often point out that while medication manages the symptoms, it doesn't necessarily address the underlying thought patterns or the social isolation that might be fueling the fire. There's also the reality of side effects, or with certain medications like benzodiazepines, the risk of dependency if used long-term without supervision. A holistic approach recognizes that the brain exists in a body, and that body exists in a community. If we only treat the chemistry without looking at the environment or the spirit, we're only solving part of the puzzle.
Let's look at those other parts of the puzzle then, specifically faith and gratitude. For some, being told to just be grateful when they're in a state of panic feels dismissive, almost like a spiritual version of just calm down. How do we bridge that gap so faith and gratitude feel like genuine anchors rather than just platitudes?
That's a critical distinction. It's not about using gratitude to bypass the pain, but rather using it to rewire the brain's focus. Neuroscientists at UCLA, specifically Dr. Matthew Lieberman, have studied what they call affect labeling, simply naming the emotion you're feeling. They found that when you label a feeling like, I am feeling overwhelmed, it actually decreases activity in the amygdala, which is the brain's alarm center, and increases activity in the prefrontal cortex, the part that handles reasoning. Gratitude works in a similar way. A study published by the National Institutes of Health showed that gratitude to God, or spiritual gratitude interventions, significantly reduced anxiety levels more than plain gratitude. It provides a sense of connection to something larger than the self, which offers a unique kind of hope that clinical interventions sometimes lack.
So it's less about counting your blessings as a chore and more about intentionally engaging the parts of the brain that help us feel safe. It seems like faith communities could be the perfect place for this. Yet many people feel that churches or religious groups are where they have to hide their struggles the most to look spiritually healthy.
That is the great irony. Faith communities have the infrastructure for deep connection, regular meetings, shared values, and a focus on service, but they can also be hotbeds for stigma if the culture prizes perfection over vulnerability. To create safe spaces, these communities have to distinguish between spiritual support and clinical support. Spiritual health, as research suggests, is about our connection to meaning and purpose. Mental health is about our emotional and social well-being. They're separate but deeply interconnected. A faith leader who can say, I can pray with you and walk with you, but I also want to help you find a licensed therapist who can help you navigate these panic attacks, is providing the ultimate form of support. They're acknowledging that God works through both prayer and the medical profession.
That brings up a practical question for those of us on the outside. If I have a friend who is in the middle of an anxious episode, what are the concrete ways I can actually help without being overbearing or dismissive? We often want to fix it, but anxiety isn't always something you can fix in the moment.
The impulse to fix is natural because we hate seeing people we love in pain, but the most helpful thing is often just being a calm anchor. Use grounding techniques. The 5-4-3-2-1 method is a great one. Ask them to name 5 things they see, 4 they can touch, 3 they hear, and so on. This forces the brain to move out of the future-oriented what-if spiral and back into the present physical environment. Another practical step is offering help with micro-tasks. When you're overwhelmed, deciding what to eat for dinner can feel like a mountain. Instead of asking, what can I do? Try saying, I'm bringing over some soup at 6. Is that okay? Reducing the number of decisions they have to make is a huge relief.
I like the idea of microtasks because it acknowledges the exhaustion that comes with anxiety. It's not just the panic, it's the fatigue of being on high alert for 72 hours straight. It seems like having an accountability partner or a dedicated support network could help catch those moments before they become full-blown crises.
Absolutely. Building those networks is about creating pre-arranged safety. It means having a conversation when you're not anxious. You tell your person, hey, when I start getting quiet and retreating, that's usually a sign my anxiety is ramping up. Can you check in on me then? This takes the burden off the person who is struggling to have to reach out when they're at their weakest. This kind of intentional community is what truly reduces stigma. When we talk about these things openly, we're showing that mental health challenges are just another part of the human condition, not a secret to be kept in the dark.
You mentioned naming the problem earlier. I've noticed that just saying, I'm having a really high anxiety day out loud to someone sometimes makes the feeling lose some of its power. Is there a reason why verbalizing it helps more than just thinking it?
It goes back to that UCLA research on affect labeling. Verbalizing the emotion involves multiple brain systems, motor speech areas for forming words, auditory processing for hearing yourself, and language centers for translation. This multi-system engagement is a form of implicit emotion regulation. It shifts you from being inside the emotion to being an observer of it. You aren't the anxiety, you are a person experiencing anxiety. That's a small shift in language, but it creates a massive shift in how much control you feel you have over the situation. It's the difference between being swept away by a river and standing on the bank watching the water move past.
And while we're standing on that bank, there's also the challenge of finding goodness in the middle of the struggle. It feels almost counterintuitive to celebrate a small victory like, I went to the grocery store today, when you're still feeling that chest pressure. But is there a long-term benefit to focusing on those small moments?
There is a significant long-term benefit. Our brains have a negativity bias, which is an evolutionary survival mechanism. We're wired to notice threats more than rewards. Chronic anxiety turns that bias up to 11. Intentionally celebrating small victories is like doing physical therapy for your brain. You're strengthening the neural pathways that recognize safety and success. Research on resilience shows that people who can find small moments of meaning or gratitude, even during high-stress periods, recover faster. It's not about ignoring the struggle, it's about refusing to let the struggle be the only thing in the room. When a community celebrates those small wins with you, it reinforces that you are making progress, even on the days that feel like a standstill.
It feels like we're describing a culture of collective empathy. If we all acknowledge that we're carrying these heavy things, the weight would be distributed more evenly. But empathy is hard to maintain when everyone is busy or dealing with their own stressors. How do we keep this community support sustainable without everyone burning out?
Sustainability comes from setting boundaries and being honest about our own capacity. If you're supporting someone with anxiety, you can't be their therapist, their doctor, and their only friend all at once. That's why the network part is so important. A single person can't carry it, but a small group can. Maybe one person handles the check-in texts, another handles the practical errands, and a faith group provides the spiritual grounding. We also have to remember that empathy isn't about feeling for someone, it's about feeling with them. It's, I'm here in the dark with you, not, I'm going to pull you out of the dark right this second. That shift in expectation prevents a lot of supporter burnout.
That's a vital reminder. We often think of support as a rescue mission, but maybe it's more like a companionship mission. Just staying present is the highest form of help. I keep coming back to the idea that isolation is the enemy. Whether it's through a formal support group, a faith-based accountability partner, or just a friend who knows the real you, that connection seems to be the common thread in every successful strategy we've discussed.
It really is. There's a landmark survey that showed a lack of social connection predicts vulnerability to disease and even early death more than smoking or high blood pressure. Connection is a biological necessity. For the person with anxiety, knowing there's a safe space where they don't have to perform being okay is life-changing. It allows the nervous system to finally take a breath. When we build communities that acknowledge mental health as a shared responsibility, we're not just helping individuals, we're creating a healthier society where fewer people have to suffer in silence.
And that includes naming the struggle, leaning into faith, and not being afraid to ask for help, whether that's from a doctor or a neighbor. It's a complex journey, and there's no shame in using every tool available to find your way through it. Even in the moments where the chest pressure feels at its worst, the presence of another person who understands can be the difference between a crisis and a manageable moment.
Exactly. Recovery isn't a straight line, and it's rarely a solitary one. It's a process of constantly returning to the light, often with someone else holding the lamp for you until you can find your own again. If we can continue to normalize these conversations, we're making that lamp much easier for everyone to find.
Moving from the suffocating isolation of anxiety toward a life of connection isn't a transition that happens overnight, but it begins the moment we stop trying to handle the weight alone. By validating the physical reality of these experiences and building communities that prioritize both spiritual grounding and clinical support, we create a safety net that catches us in our most vulnerable moments. If you found this perspective helpful, consider sharing this conversation with someone who might need to know they aren't alone in their struggle.